I moved to the Philippines on $600 a month from my CPP and OAS, and I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure it was going to work before I ever stepped off the plane in Cebu. Back home in Ontario, $600 didn't go anywhere. My rent alone was eating up over half of it. Groceries, hydro, car insurance, everything just kept climbing, and it didn't matter how careful I tried to be. Every month felt like I was paddling upstream and barely keeping my head above water. I'd done everything right. Worked for 34 years, paid into the system, showed up every single day even when I didn't want to. And when the time came to finally stop, what I had was $600 a month. That was it. No pension from my employer, no big savings account, just CPP and OAS and a hope that it would somehow be enough. It wasn't enough. Not in Canada. Not anymore. I started looking at other options the way most people do, slowly, skeptically, and mostly late at night, when I couldn't sleep because I was doing the math again in my head. The Philippines kept coming up. I'd seen a few videos, read a handful of posts on forums, and the general message seemed to be that you could stretch your money further there. Lower cost of living, warmer weather, English widely spoken. At first I thought it was one of those things that worked for other people, not for someone like me. I wasn't the type to just pick up and leave everything behind. I'd lived in the same town for most of my adult life. My daughter Catherine was there, my grandkids were there. The idea of being halfway around the world felt enormous. But the alternative felt worse. What kept stopping me, though, was the number I kept seeing everywhere I looked. Forum posts, YouTube videos, expat blogs, almost everyone seemed to agree that you needed somewhere around $20,500 to $3,000 a month to live comfortably in the Philippines. Some people said you could manage on less, but made it sound like you'd be giving up a lot to do it. And that number stuck in the back of my mind because I didn't have $2,500. I had $1,600, and not much cushion beyond that. I asked around, joined a couple of Facebook groups for Canadians living abroad, asked a few direct questions, and got a range of answers. Some people said it was absolutely doable. Others said I was setting myself up for a hard time. One guy told me I'd end up coming back within 6 months with nothing left. And I'll be honest, that comment stayed with me longer than it probably should have. Because the thing about moving abroad when you're on a fixed income is that there really isn't a lot of room for big mistakes. If I blew through my savings in the first few months, I wasn't going to be able to replace them. But I kept coming back to the same thought. What I was doing back in Ontario wasn't working either. So at a certain point, I had to make a choice. I gave myself 3 months to get ready, sold some furniture, put the rest in storage, said goodbye to Catherine and the grandkids at the airport. My granddaughter kept asking me when I was coming back, and I told her soon, not really knowing what soon meant at the time. I kept it together until I got through security. After that, I sat down at a gate chair and just stared at the departures board for a while. One thing I'd read about was needing to show onward travel when you arrive in the Philippines, proof that you weren't planning to stay indefinitely on a tourist entry. I wasn't sure how strictly they enforced it, but with everything riding on this working out, I didn't want to find out the hard way. So I booked a cheap flight to Singapore, about 4 weeks out. It wasn't part of any real plan. It was just insurance, something I could show at the border if I had to. As it turned out, nobody at immigration asked me for anything beyond my passport. But I didn't know that going in, and at that point in the process, I needed every small thing I could control to be in order. The first few days in Cebu were disorienting in a way I hadn't quite prepared for. The heat hit me the moment I walked out of the terminal. A thick, wet kind of heat that was nothing like a hot summer day back home. The traffic was relentless. The sounds were different. Even the way the light fell on the streets looked different. Everything was new at once, and my brain was trying to process all of it simultaneously. There's an excitement to those first few days that's hard to explain. Everything is fresh and strange and interesting, and part of you thinks this is all going to be fine, because look at this place. It's alive in a way that's almost intoxicating. But that feeling has a shelf. It doesn't last more than a week or two, and when it starts to fade, what replaces it is reality. The slow, unglamorous process of trying to figure out how to actually live somewhere, not just pass through it. That's when the money part became very real. I had a rough idea of what I expected to spend. I'd done the research, run the numbers, made a little spreadsheet. Rent, food, transportation, utilities, a bit extra for incidentals. On paper, it looked workable. But paper and practice are very different things, especially in the first few weeks, when you're still getting your bearings and making decisions out of convenience rather than strategy. Finding a place to rent took longer than I expected. I'd been communicating with a few landlords before I left, but things fell through or weren't quite what the photos suggested. In the meantime, I was staying in a guest house that was eating into my budget faster than a long-term rental would have. I knew it was temporary, told myself it was fine, but watching that money go out when I hadn't even found a permanent address yet was quietly stressful. When I did finally find an apartment, a small but decent place in a quieter neighborhood about 20 minutes from the city center, the deposit and first month's rent came out in one go. That's normal anywhere, but it still took a bigger chunk of my buffer than I'd planned for. Then there were small things. A fan because the apartment didn't come with one. A few kitchen items I hadn't thought to account for. A local SIM card. Nothing individually expensive, but they added up quickly in a way that caught me off guard. I remember the first time I went grocery shopping in a proper supermarket there. I walked in thinking I had a reasonable sense of what things would cost. And some things were genuinely cheaper. Fresh vegetables, local fish, rice, eggs. But then I started reaching for things out of habit. A jar of peanut butter. A certain kind of coffee I liked. Some cheese. And when I got to the checkout and saw the total, I did a double take. The imported stuff was not cheaper. In some cases it was more expensive than back home. And I realized right then that if I kept shopping the way I shopped in Guelph, my budget wasn't going to survive the Philippines any better than it survived Ontario. That was the first real adjustment moment. Not a crisis, just a wake-up call. But I didn't fully act on it right away. That's the honest truth. When you first arrive and everything is unfamiliar, you gravitate toward comfort. You go to places that feel like things you know. You eat out more than you planned because cooking in an unfamiliar kitchen with unfamiliar ingredients takes more mental effort than you want to put in when you're already managing so much newness at once. You take taxis instead of learning the jeepney routes because it's just easier. You choose the path of least resistance because your bandwidth for learning new things is already maxed out. And before you realize it, your spending in this supposedly cheaper country starts looking a lot like your spending back home, just in different currencies and different contexts. Then came the electricity bill. I knew electricity in the Philippines could be expensive. I'd read that somewhere. But reading it and experiencing it are different. I'd been running the air conditioning most nights because the heat was genuinely difficult to sleep through at first, especially coming from a country where summer nights still cool down. The bill that arrived at the end of the first month was not catastrophic, but it was significantly higher than I'd estimated. And when you're living on a fixed amount each month, significantly higher than estimated, in one category means something has to give somewhere else. I sat with that bill for a while, not panicking, but thinking, doing the math in my head again, the way I'd been doing it all those sleepless nights back in Ontario. Except now the numbers were pesos instead of dollars, and the problem was different, but the feeling was familiar. That tight, quiet worry that follows you around and makes you second-guess everything. About 3 weeks into my first month, I checked my remaining balance. I hadn't been avoiding it. I'd been checking here and there. But this time I sat down and really looked at the numbers, and it was lower than I expected it to be. Not alarmingly low. I wasn't going to run out before the month was done, but it was low enough that if things kept going the same way into month 2, I was going to have a problem by month 3. That was the moment it stopped feeling like an adventure and started feeling like a question I wasn't sure I knew the answer to. I sat in my apartment that evening with the ceiling fan going. I'd already started cutting back on the AC, and I thought seriously for the first time about whether I'd made a mistake. Not a brief passing doubt, but a real, sustained question. Had I sold my furniture and flown 14 hours and said goodbye to Catherine and the grandkids at the airport just to end up in a different version of the same situation? Had I traded financial stress in Guelph for financial stress in Cebu? Because that's what it felt like in that moment, like I'd changed the setting but not the problem. The thing is, I had to be honest with myself about what was actually happening. The problem wasn't that $600 was too small a number. The problem was that I was still behaving like someone who had more than that. I was still making the casual choices, the convenience choices, the comfort choices, without stopping to think about what they cost. Not because I was careless. I'd been careful my whole working life, but because those habits were so ingrained that I didn't even register them as choices anymore. They were just how I did things. Once I saw it clearly, the path forward wasn't complicated. It just required some real adjustment, not just telling myself I was going to adjust. I started cooking more. Not just occasionally, consistently. And I started buying local. There are markets in Cebu where you can buy fresh fish in the morning for almost nothing. Vegetables, fruit, eggs at prices that seem impossible compared to what I was used to paying. Local rice. Local cooking oil. Once I stopped buying the imported versions of things out of habit and started actually engaging with what was available and affordable where I was, the grocery portion of my budget dropped significantly. And the food was good. Better in some ways, honestly, because it was fresh in a way that supermarket produce back in Ontario often isn't. I learned the jeepney routes. It took a couple of confusing trips and one wrong destination before I got the hang of it, but once I did, getting around stopped costing what it had been costing. I figured out which times of day the AC was actually necessary for sleep and which times I could manage with just the fan and a window. Small adjustments, none of them individually dramatic, but together they changed the picture. By the end of my second month, the numbers looked different. Not drastically, but noticeably. And by month 3, I had a rhythm. Not a perfect life, not a luxury life, but a life that worked within what I had coming in each month. And that was something I hadn't been able to say in Ontario for years. There was a morning about 4 months in. Nothing special about it. Just a Tuesday or a Wednesday. I can't even remember which. When I walked down to a little spot near the water, where I'd started going for coffee in the mornings. There was a woman who ran a small stall there who'd started recognizing me and setting my order aside when she saw me coming. I sat there with my coffee watching the boats and the water and the early morning traffic going past, and I realized at some point that I hadn't thought about money in several days. Not once. I hadn't lain awake doing mental calculations. I hadn't felt that familiar low-level hum of financial anxiety that had been with me so constantly back home that I'd almost stopped noticing it. It was just gone, or at least it was quiet in a way it hadn't been in a very long time. That wasn't because everything was perfect. There were still things I'd have done differently. I would have come with a larger cushion. Even an extra $2,000 or $3,000 of savings would have made those first couple of months feel very different. I would have researched healthcare options more seriously before leaving, not after. That's something I'd encourage anyone in my situation to take seriously before making a move like this. I found a plan through a Philippine-based insurer that covered the basics at a reasonable monthly cost, but it took some time to sort out. And there was a period where I was in the country without proper coverage and just hoping nothing happened. That's not a comfortable position to be in at my age. I also hadn't fully thought through what it would cost to visit home. Catherine's family came to visit me once, which was wonderful. My grandkids seeing this completely different world was something I wouldn't trade for anything. But when I went back to Ontario for a few weeks to handle some paperwork and spend time with them there, the cost of the flight hit my budget hard. It didn't break anything, but it was a real expense I hadn't planned for the way I should have. If you're thinking about a move like this, you need a line item for international travel, not just local spending. And healthcare. I can't say it enough. If you have a pre-existing condition, and most of us over 60 have at least one, you need to understand what your coverage situation is going to look like before you leave, not after you land. I got lucky. I'd go farther than that. Being uninsured in a foreign country, even for a short stretch, is a gamble I wouldn't take again. I ended up staying in Cebu for the first year and then moved to a smaller city inland. Quieter, slower, even more affordable. My costs came down again once I made that move. I found a landlord who became a familiar face, a local market I went to every few days, a few people I'd see regularly who I'd nod hello to and sometimes stop and talk with. It became a life, not a vacation, a life. Do I miss Ontario? Parts of it, yes. I miss Catherine more than I expected to. I miss my grandkids growing up at a pace that video calls don't quite capture. I miss certain foods. There's a specific kind of rye bread I used to buy at a bakery in town that I still think about sometimes, which might be the most Canadian thing I've ever admitted. I miss the particular quality of autumn light and October and the sound of hockey on television in the background. But I don't miss the anxiety. I don't miss lying awake, running the numbers and coming up short every time. I don't miss the feeling of making every small decision through the lens of whether I could afford it. That particular weight, the one that sits on your chest when your income doesn't match where you live. I don't miss that at all. Is $600 a month enough to live in the Philippines? That depends entirely on how you live. If you try to live like you're still back home, same habits, same expectations, same conveniences, then no, it probably won't be enough. But if you actually commit to living where you are, eating what's local, learning how things work there, letting go of the imported versions of comfort you don't actually need, then yes, it's enough. It's more than enough to live without that particular kind of stress. I'm still here. I figure I'll be here for a while yet. My daughter came to visit again last spring, and watching her sit on the little terrace outside my place drinking coffee in the morning while her kids ran around and asked me questions about everything they were seeing, that was a good day. One of the better ones I've had in a long time. It wasn't the life I pictured when I was working those 34 years. But it's a life I can actually live in. And after years of just getting by, that's not a small thing.